Hello, welcome to our Unit 6 notes, Texas Revolution. We're going to continue to talk about Western expansion and talk specifically about the piece that we now call Texas and how the history of Texas goes amazingly from being in 4 different countries in about a 20-year time span to eventually become part of the United States. All right, so let's look at a map first and look at what the United States looks like after we purchased the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. You'll notice that this yellow part here, this is what we gained from France when we bought the Louisiana Purchase. This whole territory down here is what we call New Spain. So this is all Spanish territory down here. So just wanted to kind of give you an idea of where we're talking about here. This is not Texas yet, it's Spanish territory as we begin this particular story. So it's known as Tejas. It's a Spanish-controlled land, borders the United States. Tejanos were the people of Spanish heritage that lived in this area. And to give you an idea of the population, because we're going to talk about how it grows here, in 1821, the population of this area was about 4,000 Tejanos. So about 4,000 Spanish people living in this particular area. Now, the Spanish government wants to encourage people to move to this area, what's now known as Tejas, or what's now Texas, and they want to encourage people to move down there by giving them huge tracts of land that they can then farm and they can own the land. It's kind of very similar to what the United States does when they're encouraging settlement in the Great Plains, and they have the Homestead Act, for example, where they're encouraging people to come out, and essentially if you live there, you get free land. So this is very attractive to a lot of people to come down into this area and potentially get free land. One of the people that looks at this as a really profitable adventure is Moses Austin. Now, interestingly enough, Moses Austin happens to live in Missouri at the time. He goes down to this particular area and talks to the Spanish government and tries to convince them to let Americans come down to this particular part of New Spain and colonize. Now, they would still have to follow the Spanish laws. Technically, they would be American citizens kind of moving down into this area, but then the Spanish government saying you have to follow our laws and you have to become Spanish citizens. So Moses Austin convinces the Spanish government to allow him to bring a group of families down to this area. Moses Austin goes back to Missouri in 1821 and unfortunately gets pneumonia and dies in Missouri in 1821. While this is happening, his son is going down into this area, and while his son goes down into this particular area, they receive news that Mexico gained its independence from Spain at the exact same time. So as we started this story, it was Spanish territory. Mexico declares its independence from Spain, very similar to how the American colonies declared their independence from England. And so now, as Stephen Austin is moving down into this particular area with a group of American families to settle, they're no longer dealing with the Spanish government, they're now dealing with the brand new Mexican government. So this is an idea of what we're talking about. This is all Mexico, okay? So Stephen Austin is bringing down 297 families to settle in Texas between 1821 and 1827. Now, even though it's technically not 300 families, this group of families is usually affectionately called the Old 300. So when you talk about Texas history, if you can trace your family back to one of these original 300 families, that's kind of a big deal. So the Old 300 are coming down into this particular area and settling. Now, by 1831, the Americans outnumber the original Tejanos 6-1. So for every one original Spanish settler that's there are now 6 Americans. The total population is now around 30,000 people. So you can kind of begin to see what's happening. The Americans are moving down in large numbers. They're outnumbering the native Spanish, and so there's beginning to be a conflict here. The Americans are going to eventually begin to think about, well, we have a huge numbers advantage. What if we just decide that we want this territory and we don't want to follow the laws of the Mexican government. Now, at this time period, Santa Anna was the president of Mexico. He's also kind of the military leader of Mexico at the same time. And he becomes very suspicious and not really sure of all these American families that are moving down into this area. So Santa Anna discovers a letter that Stephen Austin had written, saying that he's kind of encouraging a rebellion, supposedly among the Americans. All right. So once Santa Anna finds this letter, Stephen Austin is eventually jailed for a year, and the Texans become very upset with the fact that Santa Anna has basically taken their leader and put their leader in jail. So on March 2nd, 1836, the Texans declare independence from Mexico. Okay? So the people that live in that area have now declared themselves independent from Mexico, and Texas declares themselves their own country. Now, again, once you declare that you have independence, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're your own country. It just means that you're fighting for independence. So war breaks out in Texas in 1836. Sam Houston is placed in charge of the Texas Army, and we'll talk about here in a little bit how there's kind of some similarities between Sam Houston and what happens with the Texans and things like that. But Sam Houston is, in some regards, kind of like the George Washington of the Texas Revolution. He's the person that is in charge of the entire military for the Texas Revolution. Now, probably one of the most famous events of the Texas Revolution happens at the Alamo. So the Alamo is stationed in what's now San Antonio, Texas. It's an old Spanish mission, and the Texans go there to kind of protect this particular area and some cannons from the Mexican army. The Mexican army shows up. The Mexican army surrounds this mission called the Alamo, and it's actually much larger than just what you see today as far as that one building. It really looks like this. This is just, just like the building that we kind of see today. But then you have this whole compound. This is really the entire Alamo. If you go to the Alamo today, you just see a couple of the smaller buildings that are left, but this is the entire Alamo. Now, it gets pretty involved, but the Mexican army comes and surrounds the Alamo, and they're waiting for Sam Houston to send reinforcements to the Alamo to help them out. Sam Houston knows that Santa Anna has, in a lot of ways, kind of laid a trap for them, and so Sam Houston does not send reinforcements to the Alamo. He doesn't do this because, he obviously wants to see the Texans die at the Alamo, but he knows that if Santa Anna creates this trap for him and Sam Houston brings a bunch of troops down there, it could be the end of the entire revolution. So again, some similarities between George Washington, Sam Houston, as far as kind of understanding when to be able to pick the battles that they know they could possibly win to have a chance to win the revolution. So after surrounding the Alamo for 13 days, the Mexican army finally attacks the Texans in the Alamo. The Texans inside the Alamo are very, very outnumbered. The battle is a bloodbath for the Texans. Painting of the inside the Alamo. And we'll come back to that. So when the Mexican soldiers took the Alamo, all but 5 Texans had fought to the death. So again, part of this is kind of myth, some of it's kind of legend, but a total of about 183 Texans were killed in the battle, including some very famous figures. Davy Crockett, for example, was in the Alamo and supposedly killed inside the Alamo. So this is a huge, when you look at casualties, this is a huge loss for the Texans, and the Mexican army basically just wipes out all the Texans that are at the Alamo. Now, if you go to San Antonio today, you'll still see a lot of things that are named the Alamo. This is a logo from the 2004 Final Four. And notice, they even have the Alamo, the outline of the Alamo built into the logo. There's a lot of businesses and place names and things associated with the Alamo down in San Antonio. Now, the reason why the battle at the Alamo becomes important is that it becomes a rallying cry for the Texans, all right? The people that fight and die at the Alamo are seen as heroes, and the phrase that becomes known after this battle is, "Remember the Alamo." You've probably heard that before. So after the battle at the Alamo, and then another battle that happens at Goliad shortly after that. Goliad was a battle where supposedly some of the Texans were trying to surrender, and Santa Anna just goes and slaughters them instead of allowing them to surrender. So the Alamo and the Goliad are examples that really fire up the Texans. And a lot of people that were kind of on the fence and really didn't know if they wanted to fight in this revolution, once these two events happen, it inspires them to then join the cause and really get behind the Texas independence movement. So, yes, the Alamo and Goliad were losses, but in a bigger sense, it really rallies the Texans to then fight against Santa Anna and the Mexican army. So the deciding battle was the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna and his men are surrounded by the Texans. Sam Houston picks the exact right moment to kind of ambush Santa Anna. Santa Anna is having to chase Sam Houston throughout the wilderness, and then Sam Houston finally finds a place that he feels like he has the advantage, and then that's where the Battle of San Jacinto takes place. Santa Anna is eventually captured, and he is forced to sign a treaty giving Texas their freedom. Now, again, it's a little bit more detailed than that. It's a very interesting history if you want to kind of dig a little bit deeper. But in essence, Santa Anna is forced to giving Texas their independence. So just kind of give you an idea of what's happening. This is the Alamo. You've got Goliad over here, San Jacinto over here. I'm sorry, this is Goliad down here. You've got San Jacinto right here. And then we're going to talk a little bit later about this area. Even though Mexico gives Texas their independence, there's still a whole bunch of land that's disputed between Texas and Mexico. And this is going to come in later when we talk about the United States fighting Mexico in a separate war, later known as the Mexican-American War. So just kind of keep that in mind, and we'll talk about this disputed land a little bit later. So Texas becomes their own country. They call themselves the Lone Star Republic. They officially become an independent nation in 1836, and this is their flag. They have a constitution, they have a flag, they create their own government, their own currency. They are their own country, known as the Lone Star Republic in 1836. So this right here is the country, the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic. The president of the Lone Star Republic is Sam Houston. Again, continue to see the similarities between George Washington and Sam Houston there. He is easily elected in a vote. He's the military leader of the revolution, and then he is the first president of the Republic of Texas. Now, eventually people start to think, well, these are essentially Americans living down in Texas. There's going to be some huge advantages to them becoming part of the United States instead of just remaining their own independent country. Yes, there are some people that want Texas to remain their own independent country, but the people that really have the plans to make Texas eventually part of the United States are eventually going to be the ones that win out. The big question, though, is Northerners are worried that if Texas does become part of the United States, then it could be a very powerful slave state because it's obviously as far south as you can get. Slave plantation type things would be extended into Texas. And so the big question is, what if Texas becomes part of the United States? Would it be a slave state? So this is the map. This is the United States at the time. This is the Republic of Texas. This is all that disputed land we talked about. This is Mexico, okay? And again, we're just looking at what is now the United States. This obviously down here is also part of Mexico, but we're just looking at what eventually becomes the United States here. But again, the big question is, should Texas, if it does join the United States, should it be a slave state? And how powerful will that be in upsetting the power and potentially giving the South an advantage? Now, eventually, Texas does become part of the United States. They are their own independent country for 9 years, but they do become part of the United States in 1845. And we'll talk a little bit about how the dynamics of them becoming a state and also allowing slavery are going to impact things as we start to talk about the events that eventually lead us to the Civil War. So we're 16 years away from the Civil War at this point. But just kind of keep again in the back of your mind, Texas becoming a slave state, that's going to be one more of these dominoes that begins to kind of fall as we get closer to the start of the Civil War. All right, so that is our notes on the Texas Revolution. Again, pretty incredible story in about, a 20-year time span. This one section of land goes from being Spanish territory to being Mexican territory, to becoming the Lone Star Republic, the independent Texas, and then eventually becoming part of the United States. So, in about a 20-year time span, this one section of land changes hands with 4 different countries. So, very unique piece of American history and just one part of Western expansion. Thanks, guys.